My name is Margaret Hale, and I am 64 years old. For most of my adult life, I believed in quiet routines, shared values, and the comfort of mutual trust. My husband, Richard, and I had been married for 22 years. We worked hard, lived modestly, and built what I thought was a stable life together. He often said one simple phrase that framed our entire marriage: "We share everything." It was his motto, his reassurance, his proof of commitment. And for years I believed him. Our home sat at the end of a quiet street lined with old maples whose roots pushed the sidewalks upward. We spent our evenings tending the garden or reading by the fireplace. Life was predictable in the way that feels safe. I had retired a few years earlier from my position as a hospital administrator, and Richard still worked part-time as a financial consultant. I trusted him with our finances because I trusted him with everything. But as I look back now, the cracks had been forming long before the break. Subtle hesitations when I asked about our savings. Unexplained withdrawals he waved off as routine. Moments when he seemed protective of the computer where he kept our banking spreadsheets. At the time, I chalked it up to stress or aging, never imagining it was a warning. Then came his mother's stroke. The hospital called on a Wednesday morning. His mother, Joanne, had been found on the floor of her apartment, disoriented but alive. Richard rushed to her side, and I followed later that afternoon. Joanne and I had always had a civil, if distant, relationship. She was a woman of iron opinions and little warmth, the sort who believed sons owed their mothers everything, even in adulthood. In the weeks that followed, Joanne's recovery proved difficult. She needed round-the-clock care and refused to move into assisted living. Richard spent more and more nights at her house, sleeping on the pull-out couch, insisting she needed him. I admired his dedication at first, but I noticed something else too. He became secretive, short-tempered, and strangely possessive about our finances. One morning, when I gently suggested hiring part-time help for his mother, he snapped. "We don't need outsiders involved. This is family business. And remember, Maggie, we share everything." It was the way he said it that unsettled me. Firm, pointed, almost threatening, as if the phrase had shifted from a promise to a rule. I tried to brush it off, reminding myself that caregiving can unravel even the most patient hearts. But late one night, as I sat alone in our living room surrounded by silence, a deep unease settled over me. I couldn't explain it then. Only that something in our life, something fundamental, was starting to tilt. I didn't know it yet, but that tilt would soon turn into a fracture. And the man who preached sharing would reveal a very different meaning of the word. And the first real crack in our marriage is still waiting to appear. The discovery came on a rainy Tuesday morning, the kind where the sky hangs low and the world feels muffled. I was balancing my checkbook, something I still preferred doing by hand, when I logged into our joint account just to be sure everything matched. At first, I thought I misread the numbers. I blinked twice, then leaned closer to the screen. $45,000. Gone. Not spent. Not transferred between our accounts. Moved. And the notation beside the transaction read, "Transfer to external account ending in 2271. My stomach dropped so sharply I felt lightheaded. I scrolled through the history again, my hands turning clammy. Another line appeared beneath the transfer, as cold and blunt as a knife blade. Initiated by Joanne Wilkins. His mother. For a moment I simply stared, trying to make the numbers rearrange themselves into something that made sense. But they didn't. The reality settled over me with slow, crushing weight. Richard had given his mother access to our joint account. Access to funds we had built together over more than 2 decades. I tried calling him first. He didn't pick up. I tried again. Straight to voicemail. His usual message, "We share everything, leave a message," landed like a stab. Something inside me steadied. A slow, deliberate clarity that comes only with deep betrayal. I called the bank next. The representative confirmed, in a tone that suggested she thought I already knew, that an additional user with full transfer privileges had been added to our account 3 months earlier. Her name, Joanne Wilkins. Added by Richard Hale. I hung up, feeling the world tilt again. When Richard finally returned home that evening, smelling faintly of hospital disinfectant and old fabric softener, I was waiting at the kitchen table with the bank statements in front of me. He paused when he saw them, his face tightening in a fleeting expression he quickly smothered. "What's all this?" he asked, setting down his keys with exaggerated calm. "You know what this is," I said. His jaw worked, as if chewing an argument. Then, with a sigh that tried to sound exasperated rather than guilty, he said, "Mom needed the money, Maggie. She's got medical bills, equipment. That doesn't give her the right to take from our joint savings," I replied quietly. His shoulders stiffened. "You're overreacting." There it was. The dismissal. The minimizing. The casual erasure of my place in the marriage. I held his gaze, feeling something inside me break with a soft but irrevocable snap. "Richard," I said, "you let someone else access our life savings. Without telling me. Without asking me. That isn't sharing." He frowned, his mouth flattening into a sharp line. "My mother took care of me. I owe her. And since we're married, what I owe is what we owe. We share everything. Isn't that what you've always said?" But I hadn't said that. He had. Always him. I realized in that moment that his motto was never about partnership. It was about entitlement. His entitlement. As he walked away, muttering under his breath, I felt the first flicker of anger. Not wild or dramatic. Cold. Steady. The kind of anger that leads to truth. The kind that leads to justice. And the line between partnership and betrayal has just been crossed. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I found myself retracing the long, tangled line of history that had shaped Richard and his mother, and shaped our marriage in quieter ways I had ignored for too long. I married Richard when I was 42 and he was 47. We were both divorced, both wary, both hoping for something steadier the second time around. His upbringing had always seemed like a footnote, a quiet shadow behind him. He grew up as an only child to a single mother who scraped by working 2 jobs, often leaving him to fend for himself. He once told me she taught him resilience, though the word felt too polished for what he described. Over the years, I learned that Joanne's love was a tight, possessive thing. The kind that praises sacrifice but demands repayment disguised as loyalty. The kind that binds rather than nurtures. I had seen flashes of her influence throughout our marriage. When Richard insisted that holidays be spent exclusively at her house, even when I longed to see my own family. When he canceled trips last minute because she needed him. When he brushed off her barbed comments about me with a shrug and a quiet, "That's just how she is." At the time, I told myself it was easier not to push. Many women of my generation have practiced the art of minimizing conflict for the sake of peace. But looking back, I see how those small concessions stacked into a quiet architecture of imbalance. Even our finances bore that shape. When we married, I brought my own savings from years of steady work. He brought less, but I never once used that as a weapon. We merged everything, building a common life. A shared home. A retirement fund. A future. But Richard never truly let go of the idea that what was his mother's. And by extension, what was mine was also hers. The next day, I visited Joanne at her house under the pretense of delivering groceries. She was sitting in her recliner, wrapped in a knitted blanket like a queen receiving audience. Her expression sharpened the moment she saw me. "Well," she said, her tone clipped. "Richard told me you were upset. $45,000 was transferred out of our account," I replied evenly. "I need to understand why." Her eyes narrowed, as if I had crossed some unspoken boundary. "I took what Richard said I could take, and I will pay it back when I can." "When you can," I repeated softly. The note on the transfer said gift. She sniffed. Richard insisted. "He owes me. And you don't understand what family obligation means." There it was again. Obligation. Loyalty. Ownership. Not partnership. I left with something new settling inside me. Not just anger. Clarity. This wasn't an isolated incident. It was the culmination of years of erosion, small acts of disregard forming a single landslide. And the more I revisited our past, the more I realized how long I had been walking with my eyes half closed. That would end now. Because clarity, once found, demands action. And the past has begun to illuminate the real motive behind the betrayal. The next week, I began gathering the pieces quietly, methodically, and without drama. I have always believed that truth does not require theatrics, only patience and attention. Years spent in hospital administration taught me that documentation is often more powerful than confrontation. Paper trails do not lie. I started by printing every bank statement from the past 18 months. Then I created a ledger, listing all unexplained withdrawals and transfers. There weren't many, but each one now felt suspicious. In the margins, I noted dates when Richard had been unusually protective of our finances. Next, I contacted the bank again and requested the full authorization record for the joint account. The representative hesitated at first, but since my name was on the account, she was legally required to provide it. When the documents arrived, my suspicions hardened into certainty. 3 months earlier, 2 days after Joanne's minor fall, the one Richard insisted was no big deal. He had logged in and added his mother as an authorized user. Full privileges. No limitations. He had signed electronically as joint owner. And he hadn't told me a word. I placed the printouts in a folder labeled Account Access, then moved on to the next layer. Medical billing. If the money had gone to legitimate medical expenses, I needed to verify that. I contacted her insurance provider, explaining that I was gathering cost information because I might be assisting with her care planning. The representative pulled up her records. Most of her expenses are covered, she said. She has premium supplemental insurance. Out-of-pocket costs this year total around $600. $600. Not $45,000. A cold clarity washed through me. That weekend, while Richard stayed at Joanne's house, I visited her home again. This time when I knew she'd be at a rehab appointment. The spare key hung, as always, beneath the chipped ceramic frog by her door. Inside her living room, I found the folder Richard kept on her finances. Several receipts. A few overdue notices. But nothing remotely close to the amount that had vanished from my account. Instead, tucked beneath a stack of papers, I found something else. A preliminary invoice for a down payment on a senior community she had been considering, one with a hefty admission fee. A $45,000 admission fee. And at the bottom, in Richard's handwriting, I'll cover the first installment. Mom deserves comfort now. Deserves comfort now. My hands trembled, not from rage, but from the quiet, devastating truth of it. Richard had not only used our money without my consent, he had committed to ongoing payments. Payments I never agreed to. Payments he assumed were his right to take from our shared life. I took photographs of every document. Slowly, methodically, then returned everything to its exact position. By the time I drove home, I knew what I had to do. Not in anger, but in resolve. This betrayal wasn't a mistake. It was a pattern of entitlement. And patterns require boundaries. Concrete ones. But before boundaries could be set, the truth needed to be revealed. All of it. And the evidence is gathering weight, ready for the moment it must be shown. By Monday, my folder of evidence had grown thick enough to feel heavy in my hands. A physical manifestation of the burden Richard had placed on our marriage. I decided it was time to test the truth against his version of it. That evening, when he came home, he looked tired, worn thin, and somehow older. I watched him drop his briefcase by the door and rub his face with both hands. For a moment, I almost softened. But truth isn't optional, and consequences don't vanish because a person appears weary. We need to talk, I said. He froze, then exhaled sharply. I figured this was coming. I opened the folder and laid the documents on the kitchen table one by one. Bank statements first. Authorization records next. Insurance coverage numbers. The senior community invoice. Photographs of the handwritten note. As I spread them out, Richard's expression shifted from annoyance to surprise to something colder and more defensive. Joanne stood abruptly, her chair scraping the floor. Come on, Richard. We don't have to listen to this. But he didn't move. He stared at the papers. Then at me. Then back at his mother. This isn't right, he murmured. You're damn right it isn't, Joanne snapped. But Richard's voice hardened. No, Mom. Not what she's asking. What we did. Silence. For the first time, Joanne seemed unsure. Richard reached for the pen. His hand trembled as he signed the authorization removal form. Joanne stared at him, betrayal etched on her face, but she said nothing. When he finished, I gathered the papers and nodded. The funds need to be returned within 30 days, I said. Otherwise, I will pursue legal action. Joanne let out a harsh laugh. You wouldn't. I will, I said calmly. Because boundaries matter. And because marriage is not a free bank account. And the confrontation has shifted the balance, for the first time, in my favor. The following month unfolded like the slow settling of dust after a long-awaited storm. Richard moved back home, though the distance between us lingered like a quiet echo. Joanne refused to speak to me directly, but she did return the money. Not all at once. Not gracefully. But she returned it. It began with a certified check for $15,000, delivered without a note. Then another $10,000 wired from a savings account I hadn't known she had. The final $20,000 came from Richard himself, who took on extra consulting work to cover the difference. It wasn't easy for him, and I didn't make it convenient. The bank restored my security controls. Joanne's access was permanently removed. New restrictions were placed on withdrawals unless both of us approved. Richard agreed without argument, something that surprised me more than anything else. But consequences go beyond money. Richard and I began counseling, though he resisted at first. "We can fix this ourselves," he said. But I insisted, because secrecy doesn't heal itself. Entitlement doesn't dissolve on its own. And forgiveness, if it ever came, needed a foundation of mutual respect, not guilt. In our third session, the therapist asked Richard why he had kept the transfer secret. He stared at the floor for a long time before answering. "I thought if I told her, she'd think I was choosing Mom over her." "And were you?" the therapist asked gently. He didn't need to answer. Silence filled the room with truth. Joanne, meanwhile, retreated into her indignation. She called Richard nearly every night, berating him for betraying her, for allowing me to humiliate her, for choosing me over her. But something had shifted in him. He began setting boundaries, softly at first, then more firmly. "I can't be your entire support system, Mom," he told her one evening while I overheard from the hallway. "And Maggie isn't the enemy." Joanne didn't take it well, but she adjusted. Slowly, resentfully. Yet she adjusted. By the end of the 30-day deadline, the money was fully returned. Every cent. And the gravity of what Richard had done, what he had risked, finally hit him. One night, he sat beside me on the couch, hands clasped tightly. "I didn't realize how much I was taking from you," he said. "Not just the money, the respect, the trust." I nodded. "I know. I want to make this right," he said. "Not because I'm afraid of losing the marriage, but because I'm afraid I already damaged what mattered most." It wasn't a perfect apology, but it was honest. And honesty, at that stage, was enough to begin rebuilding. Consequences are not meant to shatter people. They're meant to correct the path. And slowly, Richard was learning to walk differently. And healing, tentative and fragile, has begun to take root. I often sit now on our back porch in the evenings, watching the sun dip behind the maple trees. Life has calmed again, different but steadier. Richard and I are rebuilding our trust, piece by piece, through conversations once avoided, through boundaries once neglected, through honesty long overdue. Looking back, I see the truth clearly. Betrayal does not always arrive in dramatic thunderclaps. Sometimes it arrives quietly, disguised as duty or love or loyalty, masked by phrases like, "we share everything." But sharing without respect is simply taking. And love without boundaries is simply dependency. I once believed that maintaining peace meant accommodating the needs of others, even at the expense of my own. But I learned that boundaries are not walls, they are doors. They define what remains protected and what must be earned. They teach others how to treat us. They safeguard the dignity we often sacrifice without noticing. Richard now understands that marriage is not a hierarchy. It is not a ledger of debts owed to childhood ghosts. It is a partnership where decisions are built on transparency, not entitlement. And though we still navigate difficult terrain, I see genuine effort in him. And that matters more than perfection. As for Joanne, our relationship will never be warm. But it is respectful now, at least in the sense that she understands I will not be dismissed, bypassed, or used. And sometimes, respect without closeness is the most peace one can hope for. The $45,000 is back where it belongs. But more importantly, my voice is back where it belongs, uncompromised, steady, and heard. I share this story for anyone who has ever felt overshadowed, overlooked, or expected to endure silently. Justice does not always require anger. Often it requires clarity, documentation, and a calm resolve to stand firm. And sometimes, the greatest act of revenge is simply insisting on the truth and refusing to carry the weight of someone else's choices. Thank you for listening to my story. If it resonated with you, I'd love to hear your thoughts. What would you have done in my place?